Now, it's been asked here, and it is a good question, as to what my intent is with communicating these messages about pirate philosophy, liberty, autonomy, and the rest. What is the intent? I mean, certainly there is in my languaging some crossover within what might loosely be called the prepper or survivalist community. However, I would not identify myself as either of those. And certainly there are people out there that would use the language of sovereignty to communicate a certain kind of ideology, and I definitely don't have a lot of traffic with that either. Ecology is important to me, but I can no longer call myself an environmentalist. I would certainly support both the rights to liberate and emancipate both men and women from the drudgery that they have found in the historic past. I would be both a men's rights activist and a feminist, but I really can't communicate with either of those two camps very effectively. So is it just that I'm a disagreeable iconoclast? Well, that may be the case. But actually, there is a more significant reason as to why I find most isms difficult. And that's because I'm a universalist. I am much persuaded by the idea that unless you can voice a right call to a moral or ethical cause in a universal sense, it probably isn't either moral or ethical. So this is relevant within the culture that we live in, rife with what we call virtue signaling. Certainly virtue signaling and righteous indignation of various sorts. It's a pretty ubiquitous display, regardless of where one sits on the political spectrum. There's a lot of that going on. I find very little of it righteous nor virtuous. And the reason I do not is because rarely is the demand that is voiced expressed in any kind of universal sense, but rather, in spite of the fact that it is wrapped up in the trappings of ethical language, ultimately it comes down to a power play or a bid for status or an attempt to find special privilege for a special group of people, and very often at the expense of the whole. And there's nothing ethical nor virtuous about that. And this shouldn't really surprise us, for we are living in the late days of a technocratic control state where the master-slave relationship has been elevated to the level of near perfection, so that most of the individuals who live within it so effectively oppressed that they are unconscious really of their oppression, unconscious that their ideas in fact are not even their own. Their desires are not even their own. For someone who is in a position of servitude, bids for attention, bidding the master class a cheery good morning, showing allegiance and alliance with the whims and the official story of the master class. These are not done as an exhibition of virtue. They're done to gain favor and status within the hierarchy. They're done to profiteer at the expense of one's peers, also in servitude, to hope to be a little less oppressed and a little higher up the ladder, so one may be privileged to do a little more oppressing. And that could not be further from my intent, nor the intent of the philosophical material that I draw upon, which really does, again, in a heterodox manner, advocate for the liberation and emancipation of the individual, and in a universal sense, not just the physical but the metaphysical, to find the opportunity and the autonomy and the empowerment to embrace one's humanity fully as an agent of the creative process, recognizing that one's peers are not just one's neighbors, not just one's culture, not just one's gender, not just one's race, not just one's species, but the life process itself. It's a very heady attitude, and it's one that can only be embraced by an individual who legitimately has found themselves in a position of personal autonomy, authenticity, and personal empowerment. And also within this message, I understand that it is a process. It's a process that begins with a choice, no doubt, but it is a process. From Plato onward, intelligent philosophers understand that while an emancipated person may fantasize about the idea of breaking open prison cells and freeing slaves, in reality, to do so without providing the steps to embrace liberty, well, that will just simply leave a lost soul. Because, in fact, what you find once the prison doors are broke open, the prisoner may emerge, but without tools with which to cope with the larger world, which they've never experienced in a personal, first-hand manner. Well, they're lost. They've only known life within the cell, and they stand there in the sunlight near blinded. It's no wonder that many of them, by choice, retreat to the prison. I mean, there is a certain kind of safety there within that oppression. And it should be also acknowledged that, again, this is a path. It's a path that none of us have gotten to the end of. All of us who have been born into the modern technocratic control state have been born into servitude of some form, even those of the master class. And in fact, perhaps especially those of the master class find themselves in a prison of privilege with ideas that are not their own. In some ways, their prison, which is so especially comfortable, would be the most difficult one to leave behind. But for any of us who become aware of the dynamic and make the choice to no longer participate within it, to make a choice to live a self-determined, life-affirming existence rather than to be caught up in the cycle of violence and oppression and death that is our culture, well, it's a long road. And all that can be really hoped is that we, in a spirit of fraternity with each other, recognize in each other the willingness to embrace those higher universal values. And when we find peers that do so, we do the best to make our alliances there and to help us all along that path. So for myself, I have come to call this practice of engaging consciously in this process radical disengagement. Again, I'm not an insurrectionist, not a survivalist, not even a revolutionary. I simply wish to be able to live my life authentically according to my own values as best as I can express them, and to not be a compelled participant within a process of larger society that is destroying everything that I find precious. That's it. So the process that I call radical disengagement is a set of principles and practical steps by which I can go about disengaging myself from being a participant within the larger hierarchical structure. And succinctly, these 4 steps of radical disengagement, as I see it, are as follows. The first and most preliminary step is what I call divestment. And what this is it is a practical posture by which one extricates oneself, one's means of earning a living, one's means of creating value for oneself, earning a wage or what have you. As much as possible, one divests that and disengages it from being a tool of the technocratic control state. While certainly all of us must create value of some form to make our daily bread, there is a very significant difference in how it is that we go about that. Certainly there are individuals who are first-hand creators of value, whose value is largely harvested by themselves and for themselves, and what they create is created for peers, not institutions. As much as possible, we should gravitate towards those kinds of occupations. And then there are others of us who earn our livings by being basically agents of compliance for the state apparatus. And that certainly does not work towards our ends. The second step, as I see it, after one has successfully divested, is to disappear, meaning to remove from the visibility of the technocratic control state as much as possible any assets, any value that could be harvested, any income that can be subject to taxation. And certainly I'm not arguing for any kind of illegal dodges here. There's completely conventional means by which an individual can go about doing this. But the point is that if one is honest and one wants to be a life-affirming individual and one has a stance against colonialist exploitation or the destruction of the biosphere by empire, or one claims to be against war or conflict, well, it's a foolish statement if one's income directly goes to supporting all of those causes. So making one's value invisible or unusable by the technocratic control state is essential. That's what I call disappearing, which would be the second step. The third step is to adopt a policy of dispersion. I'm not in any way saying that an individual should not seek to prosper. In fact, I would say that a life-affirming individual should seek to prosper, but there are multiple ways by which to do so, and we have discussed this in a prior video. One can seek to prosper by extracting value from the commons and holding it personally, or one can, in a life-affirming process, use one's creativity to enhance the commons and thus not only enriching oneself by that process, but one's peers, one's biosphere, one's habitat. In fact, enhancing the life process. Now, to the surprise of many, is the fourth step, which I would call defense, which many would put first. But I'm also suggesting here that it's necessary to create something worth defending and to become an individual that is capable of defending before taking up the effort of defending. And by practicing the path of radical disengagement, we can find ourselves there. Something to think on. We'll discuss it further. Thanks.